The United States just deployed dozens of F-35 Lightning stealth fighters to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, 120 miles from Manila and 600 miles from the South China Sea. This is the largest forward deployment of fifth-generation fighters in the Pacific since the program began. China called it a provocative escalation. The Philippines called it necessary security cooperation. The Pentagon called it routine training. Nobody thinks it's routine, because this deployment changes everything. Clark Air Base was abandoned by the U.S. military in 1991 after Mount Pinatubo erupted and covered it in volcanic ash. For 30 years, it sat mostly empty. Now it's hosting the most advanced fighter jets on Earth, positioned perfectly to control the skies over the South China Sea, where China has been building military installations on artificial islands and claiming waters that international law says belong to the Philippines. Here's why this matters right now. In the last 3 months, Chinese Coast Guard vessels have water-cannoned Philippine fishing boats, rammed Philippine Navy ships, and occupied waters within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Philippines protested. China ignored them. Then the U.S. deployed F-35 SEC to a base that overlooks those disputed waters. Message sent, message received. This is what the F-35 deployment actually means. Why Clark Air Base is the perfect location to counter China, and why Beijing is more worried about this than they're admitting publicly. The F-35 isn't just another fighter jet. It's a flying computer with stealth capabilities that make it invisible to Chinese radar systems. China has spent 2 decades building an air defense network across the South China Sea. The F-35 makes most of that investment worthless. Here's what the F-35 can do that Chinese fighters can't counter. It flies at 1,200 miles per hour while being nearly invisible to radar. Its RCS, radar cross-section, is 0.0001 square meters. That's the size of a golf ball. Chinese radars are designed to track aircraft with RCS of 1.5 square meters. They literally cannot see F-35 SEN until they're within 20-30 miles, and by then it's too late. The F-35 sensors can detect Chinese aircraft and ships from 150 miles away. It sees them. They don't see it. That's not an advantage. That's dominance. In air combat, the first aircraft to detect the enemy wins 90% of engagements. The F-35 will always detect first. But it gets worse for China. Each F-35 can carry 6 AIM-120 missiles internally while maintaining stealth. Those missiles have a range of 100 miles, so an F-35 flying over the South China Sea can shoot down Chinese aircraft from 100 miles away while remaining completely invisible to Chinese radar. The Chinese pilots wouldn't know they were under attack until their aircraft started exploding. China's newest fighter, the J-20, is supposed to be stealthy. U.S. intelligence assessments say its RCS is 10 of 100 times larger than the F-35. It's stealthier than older Chinese fighters. It's not in the same category as American stealth technology. And even if it were equal, China has maybe 50 J-20 shaped. The U.S. has over 1,000 F-35 seen, with dozens now stationed 600 miles from Chinese military installations. The deployment at Clark Air Base puts F-35 SEF within combat range of every Chinese military installation in the South China Sea without refueling. Subi Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, all the artificial islands China built and militarized, they're all within 600 miles. The F-35's combat radius is 670 miles. Do the math. Every Chinese position is now within range of aircraft they cannot detect on radar. Clark Air Base isn't just convenient, it's the single best location in Southeast Asia for projecting air power into the South China Sea while being outside China's immediate strike range. Location first, Clark is 120 miles north of Manila, far enough from the capital that combat operations don't threaten the Philippine government directly. It's 600 miles from the Spratly Islands, where China has built 7 military bases. It's 700 miles from Hainan Island, where China's South Sea Fleet is headquartered. Close enough to matter, far enough to create a buffer. The base infrastructure is already built. Clark was a major U.S. Air Force base from 1903 to 1991. At its peak, it housed 15,000 American personnel and was the largest U.S. military installation in Asia, outside of Okinawa. The runways can handle any aircraft the U.S. operates. The maintenance facilities are massive. The fuel storage is already there. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, the U.S. abandoned the base because the volcanic ash made it temporarily unusable, not because the infrastructure was inadequate. For 30 years, Clark sat mostly abandoned. Some commercial aviation, some industrial parks, but militarily it was empty. The Philippines and the U.S. never formally closed their security relationship. But without active bases, American military presence in the Philippines was minimal. China watched this and took notes. No American bases meant no American military pressure. China escalated activities in the South China Sea accordingly. The Philippines and U.S. signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This gave the U.S. access to Philippine military bases for rotational deployments, not permanent bases that would violate the Philippine Constitution, but rotational presence that accomplishes the same thing strategically. Clark Air Base was designated as one of 9 locations where U.S. forces could operate. And now in 2025, dozens of F-35 SIRS are stationed there. Not visiting, stationed, with full support infrastructure, maintenance capability, and combat readiness. This isn't a training exercise. This is forward deployment. To understand why the U.S. deployed F-35 sound, you need to understand what China has been doing in the South China Sea for the last decade. Because this didn't happen in a vacuum. This is a response to Chinese aggression that has been escalating steadily. In 2013, China started building artificial islands on reefs in the Spratly Islands. They dredged sand from the seafloor and piled it on coral reefs to create new land. Then they built military installations on that land. Runways, hangars, barracks, radar installations, anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles. They militarized 7 reefs into 7 military bases in international waters. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled that China's claims to the South China Sea had no legal basis. The Philippines brought the case. The tribunal sided with the Philippines, and China said they didn't recognize the ruling. Then they continued building military installations and claiming the waters anyway. Starting in 2020, Chinese Coast Guard vessels became increasingly aggressive toward Philippine ships. They would ram Philippine fishing boats. They would water cannon Philippine Navy vessels. They would block Philippine supply missions to their own military outpost on Second Thomas Shoal. These weren't accidents or isolated incidents. This was systematic intimidation. In early 2024, a Chinese Coast Guard ship rammed a Philippine Navy vessel, causing significant damage and injuring several Filipino sailors. The Philippines protested. China claimed the Philippine ship had entered Chinese waters illegally, except those waters were inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, 120 miles from Palawan, 600 miles from mainland China. Under international law, those waters belong to the Philippines. China doesn't care about international law, and here's what made it worse. The Philippines realized they couldn't defend their own waters. Their navy is mostly World War II-era ships and a few modern patrol boats. Their Air Force has no modern fighters, just some old Korean-made trainers armed with rockets. Against China's modern military, the Philippines has essentially no capability to resist. So they called the U.S., and the U.S. showed up with F-35 SES. Beijing understands exactly what this deployment means. Chinese military planners aren't stupid. They know what F-35 scenes at Clark Air Base represent strategically. And they know their options just got significantly worse. Before the F-35 deployment, China's strategy in the South China Sea was working perfectly. Build artificial islands, militarize them, use Coast Guard vessels to intimidate neighbors, gradually establish control over waters they claim. The U.S. would complain diplomatically, but wouldn't station forces close enough to actually intervene. The F-35 deployment changes that calculation entirely. Now, if China escalates, they're not just facing the Philippine Coast Guard that they can easily intimidate. They're facing American stealth fighters that can destroy every Chinese military installation in the South China Sea in a matter of hours. Here's the scenario that terrifies Chinese planners. China uses military force against a Philippine ship. The Philippines invokes the Mutual Defense Treaty with the U.S. American F-35 Cybus launch from Clark Air Base, 40 minutes from the South China Sea. They destroy Chinese radar installations first, so China can't track anything. Then they destroy anti-aircraft defenses. Then they destroy every military aircraft on those artificial islands while they're still on the ground. China's entire South China Sea military infrastructure gets neutralized in a single day before their mainland forces can even respond. Can China prevent this? Not really. They could try to strike Clark Air Base with ballistic missiles, but that means attacking Philippine territory and American forces simultaneously. That's an act of war against two countries. And even if they launched missiles, the U.S. has Patriot missile defense at Clark and Aegis-equipped ships in the area. Some missiles might get through. Most wouldn't, and the F-35 Cyv would already be in the air because they'd launch as soon as Chinese missile activity was detected. China's best option is to not escalate in the first place. That's exactly what the U.S. wants. The F-35 deployment isn't primarily about fighting China. It's about making China think twice before using force against the Philippines. It's deterrence. And deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing and able to follow through. The F-35 deployment proves both. The U.S. is willing to station advanced fighters on Philippine soil, and those fighters are capable of destroying China's military infrastructure if China forces the issue. Beijing can still claim the South China Sea, but they can't use military force without risking a conflict with American stealth fighters that they cannot match technologically. Hosting American F-35 Cyv puts the Philippines in China's crosshairs. Beijing could retaliate economically. They could pressure the Philippines through diplomatic channels. They could increase military activities near Philippine territory as intimidation. The Philippines knows all this. They accepted the deployment anyway, because they have no other choice. China has been taking Philippine territory piece by piece, and the Philippines cannot stop them alone. Their military is too weak. Their economy is too dependent on trade. And the only ally capable of matching China militarily is the United States. The Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and Philippines dates back to 1951. It states that an armed attack on either country's armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific area would trigger mutual defense obligations. For decades, this treaty was mostly symbolic. Now it's becoming operational. The F-35 deployment makes the treaty credible. If China attacks Philippine forces, American stealth fighters stationed in the Philippines would respond immediately. But there's domestic opposition in the Philippines. Some politicians and activists argue that hosting American military forces makes the Philippines a target and compromises sovereignty. They remember that Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Base were closed in 1991 to 1992, partly due to anti-American sentiment. The Philippine Senate refused to renew the base agreements, and the U.S. withdrew. That was then. The strategic situation is completely different now. In 1991, China wasn't militarizing the South China Sea. China wasn't ramming Philippine ships. China wasn't claiming waters that belonged to the Philippines under international law. The threat was theoretical. Now it's real. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has been clear. The enhanced defense cooperation with the U.S. is necessary to protect Philippine sovereignty. When Chinese vessels ram Philippine ships in Philippine waters and the Philippines can't defend itself, they need help. The U.S. is willing to help. The price is allowing American forces to operate from Philippine bases. Most Filipinos accept this trade-off because the alternative is watching China take their territory unopposed. The F-35 deployment at Clark Air Base doesn't solve the South China Sea dispute. China still claims the waters. The Philippines still disputes those claims. But the deployment changes what China can do about it. Expect Chinese military activities near the Philippines to increase, not because China wants to escalate, but because they want to test American commitment. Chinese aircraft will fly closer to Philippine airspace. Chinese ships will sail closer to Philippine waters. They're probing. How will the U.S. respond? Will the F-35 SEADs actually launch, or is this deployment symbolic? The U.S. will respond with shows of force. F-35 patrols over the South China Sea. Joint exercises with the Philippine military. Publicized deployments showing that the aircraft are operational and ready. The goal is to demonstrate that the deployment is real and the U.S. will use these aircraft if necessary. But nobody wants actual combat. China doesn't want to start a shooting war with American stealth fighters. The U.S. doesn't want a war with China. The Philippines definitely doesn't want a war on their doorstep. So what happens is a very tense standoff where China continues low-level aggression, the Philippines protests, and the U.S. maintains a visible military presence that says, don't push too far. This is the new normal in the South China Sea. Chinese militarization of artificial islands. American stealth fighters in the Philippines. Both sides trying to achieve their goals without triggering actual conflict. It's not peace, it's managed tension, and it's going to continue for years. But here's what the F-35 deployment accomplished. China's window for taking disputed territory by force just closed. They can still claim it. They can still build on it. They can still send Coast Guard vessels, but they can't use their military to seize Philippine-controlled features without risking a response from American aircraft that they cannot match. That's deterrence. That's the point. And that's why dozens of F-35 SAR are now stationed at Clark Air Base, ready to fly at a moment's notice, maintaining the fragile balance between Chinese ambition and regional stability in one of the most contested bodies of water on Earth.